is a name broader and more definite than the term organic evolution. It is more euphonious than any phrase meaning life adaptation. It involves and suggests no theory as to the origin of the phenomena it describes. The theory of descent of plants and animals is defined by the same authors as the belief that organs and species as we know them are derived from other and often simpler forms by processes of divergence and adaptation. According to this theory, all forms of life now existing, or that have existed on the earth, have risen from other forms of life which have previously lived in turn. All character attributes of species and groups have developed with changing conditions of life. The homologies among animals are the results of common descent. The differences are due to various influences, one of the leading forces among these being competition and the struggle for existence between individuals and between species, whereby those best adapted to their surroundings live and produce their kind. This theory is now the central axis of all biological investigation in all its branches, from ethics to histology, from anthropology to bacteriology. In the light of this theory, every peculiarity of structure, every character or quality of individual or species has a meaning and a cause. It is the work of the investigator to find this meaning as well as to record the fact. One of the noblest lessons left to the world by Darwin, says Frank Kramer, is this, which to him amounted to a profound, almost religious conviction, that every fact in nature, no matter how insignificant, every stripe of color, every tint of flowers, the length of an orchid's nectary, unusual height in a plant, all the infinite variety of apparently insignificant things, is full of significance. For him it was an historical record, the revelation of a cause, the lurking place of a principle. It is therefore a fundamental principle of the science of bionomics that every structure and every function of today finds its meaning in some condition or in some event of the past. Darwin's own view of the doctrine of descent is clearly set forth in the following passages from the Origin of Species. Authors of the highest eminence seem to be fully satisfied with the view that each species has been independently created. To my mind, it accords better with what we know of the laws impressed on matter by the Creator, that the production and extinction of the past and present inhabitants of the world should have been due to secondary causes, like those determining the birth and death of the individual. When I view all beings not as special creations, but as the lineal descendants of some few beings which lived long before the first bed of the Cambrian system was deposited, they seem to me to become ennobled. Judging from the past, we may safely infer that not one living species will transmit its unaltered likeness to a distant futurity, and of the species now living, very few will transmit progeny of any kind to a far distant futurity. For the manner in which all organic beings are grouped shows that the greater number of species in each genus, and all the species in many genera, have left no descendants, but have become utterly extinct. We can so far take a prophetic glance into futurity as to foretell that it will be the common and widely spread species, belonging to the larger and dominant groups within each class, which will ultimately prevail and procreate new and dominant species. As all the living forms of life are the lineal descendants of those which lived long before the Cambrian epoch, we may feel certain that the ordinary succession by generation has never once been broken, and that no cataclysm has desolated the whole world. It is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent upon each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms, or into one, and that, while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. What organic evolution does not mean is a topic which deserves some attention before discussing the evidences for evolution. President Jordan has written in Footnotes to Evolution a strong statement concerning this, wherein he says, "Evolution is not a theory that man is a developed monkey. The question of the immediate origin of man is not the central or overshadowing question of evolution. This question offers no special difficulties in theory, although the materials for exact knowledge are in many directions incomplete. Homologies more perfect than those connecting man with the great group of monkeys could not exist. These imply the blood relationship of the human race with the great host of apes and monkeys. As to this, there can be no shadow of a doubt, and, as similar homologies connect man with all members of the group of mammals, similar blood relationships must exist, and homologies less close but equally unmistakable connect all backbone animals one with another, and the lowest backbone types are closely joined to worm-like forms not usually classed as vertebrates. It is perfectly true that in the higher or anthropoid apes, the relations with man are extremely intimate, but man is not simply a developed ape. Apes and men have diverged from the same primitive stock, ape-like, man-like, but not exactly the one nor the other. No apes nor monkeys now extant could apparently have been ancestors of primitive man. None can ever develop into man. As man changes and diverges, race from race, so do they. The influence of effort, the influence of surroundings, the influence of the sifting process of natural selection, each acts upon them as it acts upon man. The process of evolution is not progress, but better adaptation to conditions of life. As man becomes fitted for social and civic life, so does the ape become fitted for life in the treetops. The movement of monkeys is toward simianity, not humanity. The movement of cat life is toward felinity. That of the dog races toward caninity. Each step in evolution, upward or downward, whatever it may be, carries each species or type farther from the primitive stock. These steps are never retraced. For an ape to become a man, he must go back to the simple characters of the simple common type from which both have sprung. These characters are shown in the ape baby and in the human embryo in its corresponding stages. For ancestral traits lost in the adult are evident in the young. This persistence comes through the operation of the great force of cell memory which we call heredity. The evidence of biology points to the descent of all mammals, of all vertebrates, of all animals, of all organic beings from a common stock. Of all the races of animals, the anthropoid apes are nearest man. Their divergence from the same stock must be comparatively recent. Man is the nomadic, the apes are the arboreal branch of the same great family. Evolution does not teach that all or any living forms are tending toward humanity. It does not teach, as in Bishop Wilberforce's burlesque, that every favorable variety of the turnip is tending to become man. It is not true that evolutionists expect to find, as Dr. Seelye has affirmed, the growth of the highest alga into a zoophyte, a phenomenon for which sharp eyes have sought, and which is not only natural, but inevitable on the Darwinian hypothesis, and whose discovery would make the fame of any observer. It is no wonder that a clear thinker should have rejected the Darwinian hypothesis when stated in such terms as this. The line of junction in evolution is always at the bottom. It is the lowest mammals which approach the lowest reptiles. It is the lower types of plants which approach the lower types of animals. It would be the lowest alga, to use Dr. Cilli's illustration, which would be transmutable into the lowest zoophyte. It is the unspecialized, undifferentiated type from which branches diverge in different ways. Humanity is not the goal of evolution, not even that of human evolution. There will be no second creation of man, except from man's own loins. There will not be a second Anglo-Saxon race unless it has the old Anglo-Saxon blood in its veins. Adaptation by divergence, for the most part of slow stages, is the movement of evolution. While occasional leaps or sudden changes occur in the process, they are by no means the rule. In most cases of saltatory evolution, the suddenness is in appearance only. It comes from our inability to trace the intermediate stages. When an epoch-making character is acquired, as the wings of a bird or the brain of man, the process of readjustment of other characters goes on with greatly increased rapidity. But this rapidity of evolution is along the same lines as the slower processes. Radical changes from generation to generation never occur. We do not expect to find birds arising from a flying fish in the air whose scales are disparting into feathers. A flying fish is no more of the nature of a bird than any other fish is. A cow will never give birth to a horse, nor a horse to a cow. The slow operation of existing causes is the central fact of organic evolution, as it is of the evolution of mountains and valleys. Seasons change as the relations which produce them change, but midsummer never gives way to midwinter in an instant, nor does the child in an instant become a man, though in some periods of growth, epoch-marking causes may make development more rapid. Life is conservative. The law of heredity is the expression of its conservatism. Life changes slowly, but it must constantly change, and all change is, by necessity, divergence. There is in nature no single law of progress, nor is progress in any group a necessity, regardless of conditions. That which we call progress rests simply on the survival of the better adapted, their survival being accompanied by their reproduction. Those that live repeat themselves. The innate tendency toward progression of the early evolutionists is a philosophic myth. Progress and degeneration are alike the resultants of the various forces at work from generation to generation, on and within a race or species. The same forces which bring progress to a group under one set of conditions will bring degradation under another. In their essence, the factors of evolution are no more laws of progress than the attraction of gravitation is. Cosmic order comes from gravitation. Organic order comes from the factors of evolution. Evolution is simply orderly change. Nor is evolution identical with the notion of spontaneous generation. There is no necessary connection between the one theory and the other. If there is now spontaneous generation of protoplasm, it cannot take the form of any creature we know. An organism fresh from the mint of creation would be too small for us to see with any microscope. It would be too simple for us to trace by any instrumentality now in our possession. It would contain but a few molecules, and a molecule in a drop of water is as small as an orange beside the sun. Such a race of creatures, spontaneously generated, without concessions to environment, would grow hoary with the centuries before it came to our notice. its descendants would have belonged for ages to the unnumbered host of microbes before we should be aware of its creation. Evolution is not a creed or a body of doctrine to be believed on authority. There is no saving grace in being an evolutionist. There are many who take this name and have no interest in finding out what it means or in making any application of its principles to the affairs of life. For one who cares not to master its ideas, there is no power in the word. Evolution is not a panacea or a medicine to be applied to social or personal ills. It is simply an expression of the teaching of an enlightened common sense as to the order of changes in life. If its principles are mastered, a knowledge of evolution is an aid in the conduct of life, as knowledge of gravitation is essential in the building of machinery. There is nothing occult in the science of evolution. It is not the product of philosophic meditation or of speculative philosophy. It is based on hard facts, and with hard facts it must deal. It seems to me that it is not true that evolution is a new religion, the religion of the future. There are many definitions of religion, but evolution does not fit any of them. It is no more a religion than gravitation is. One may imagine that some enthusiastic follower of Newton may, for the first time, have seen the majestic order of the solar system, may have felt how futile was the old notion of guiding angels, one for each planet, to hold it up in space. He may have received his first clear vision of the simple relations of the planets, each forever falling toward the sun and toward one another, each one by the same force forever preserved from collision. Such a man might have exclaimed, "Great is gravitation, it is the new religion, the religion of the future." In such manner, men trained in dead traditions, once brought to a clear insight of the noble simplicity and adequacy of the theory of evolution, may have exclaimed, "Great is evolution, it is the new religion, the religion of the future." But evolution is religion in the same sense that every truth of the physical universe must be religion. That which is true is the truest thing in the world, and the recognition of the infinite soundness at the heart of the universe is an inseparable part of any worthy religion. The evidences which have convinced men of science that the origin of the various species of plants and animals, through descent, is a fact, are many and are drawn from various sources. However, no more than an outline of those facts, which help best to an understanding of the doctrine, can be given here. The same facts were once used in debate concerning the probabilities of the truth or untruth of the doctrine of descent. But today the biologist feels it unnecessary to stand as an advocate arguing for belief in evolution. As the days have long passed when the shape of the earth or the behavior of the members of the solar system was a fit subject for debate, so the days are now closed when the truth or falsity of the law of organic descent is a debatable thesis. That the earth is subspherical, that the planets revolve about the sun, and that species of organisms descend from other species are now to be considered matters uncontrovertible. Darwin wrote for a generation which had not accepted evolution, and which poured contempt on those who upheld the derivation of species from species by any natural law of descent. He did his work so well that descent with modification is now universally accepted as the order of nature in the organic world, and the rising generation of naturalists can hardly realize the novelty of this idea, or that their fathers considered it a scientific heresy to be condemned rather than seriously discussed. End of section 14. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois.
Section 15 of The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5, edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Biology, Chapter 10, Morphology and Embryology, Part 1. The facts of biology, which admit of adequate explanation only in connection with the theory of descent, are grouped by Romanes and other writers on organic evolution under the heads of morphology, embryology, classification, paleontology, distribution, and domestication. In all these lines, the facts are drawn together by a strong thread of unity. There are numberless similarities and correlations and surprising uniformities. The great variety of life as exhibited in the countless species of plants and animals has been referred to, and yet, great as this variety is, there are, after all, only a few types of structure among all animals and plants, some 3 or 4 or 8 or 10 general modes of development, and all the rest are modifications from these few types. It is, moreover, true that all living forms are but series of modifications and extensions of one single plan of structure. All have the same ultimate substance, the mysterious semi-fluid network of protoplasm, which is, so far as is known, the physical basis of all life, and the equally mysterious nuclear substance, or chromatin, which in some fashion presides over all the movements of the protoplasm and is the physical basis of the phenomena of heredity. The same laws of heredity, variability, and of response to outside stimulus hold in all parts of the organic world. All organisms have the same need of reproduction. All are forced to make concession after concession to their surroundings, and in these concessions, all progress in life consists. And at last, each organism, or each alliance of organisms, must come to the greatest concession of all, which is called death. The unity in life, then, is not less a fact than is life's great diversity. Whatever emphasis is laid upon the diversity of life, the essential unity of all organisms must not be forgotten. An examination of the facts in each of the lines of evidence makes it clear that the only reasonable explanation for the existence of a fundamental unity in organic life is the theory of descent, i.e., that similarities are due to blood relationship and that differences come from adaptive modifications. The facts adduced from morphology, being the result of researches into the structure of adult animals and plants, lead to a preview of certain principles of adaptation necessary for their interpretation. First, it must be noted that some structures are not non-adaptive, that is, do not change to fit changed habits or conditions of life. Such structures or organs are most often found internally. For illustration, a change in the locomotive habit of a bird from that of flying to that of an ostrich is associated with an adaptive modification of locomotor structures, legs, and wings, but not in any striking way is there change in the internal organs. Internal organs may persist unchanged, and hence they offer good guides to classification. On the other hand, external structures are likely to undergo adaptation when habits or conditions of life change. Hence, as Jordan has said, the inside of an animal tells the real history of its ancestry. The outside tells us only where its ancestors have been. In the second place, it must be noted that adaptations to similar conditions may result in superficial resemblances. For example, there is a superficial resemblance between the wing of an insect and the wing of a bird, both adaptations to an aerial environment, between the heart of an insect and the heart of a vertebrate animal, both adaptations for pumping blood, between the fin of a fish and the paddle of a whale, both adaptive swimming organs, Yet, the resemblance in these cases does not go deeper than the surface. It is one of function only. All such cases of resemblance in function, but not in detailed plan of structure, are called analogies, and mean nothing more than similarity of environment. Turning to more fundamental resemblances, such as the wing of a bat and the wing of a bird, careful study shows detailed internal as well as external similarities of structure. Such cases are homologies. On the one hand, then, are found structures which are perfectly analogous and yet in no way homologous. Totally different structures are modified to perform the same functions. On the other hand, are found structures which are perfectly homologous and yet in no way analogous. The structural elements remain, but are profoundly modified to perform totally different functions. Homology thus means identity of structure which is the result of identity of parentage. It is the stamp of heredity. It means blood relationship. These principles of homology are essential to a correct interpretation of the facts of morphology. The most striking fact of similar structure among plants and among animals is the existence of a common general plan in any group. Since backboned animals are best known to most readers, they may be taken as an illustration. All vertebrate animals, and none other, says LeConte, have an internal jointed skeleton worked by muscles on the outside. The relation of skeleton and muscle in arthropods is exactly the reverse. In all vertebrates, and in none other, the axis of this skeleton is a jointed backbone, vertebral column, enclosing and protecting the nervous centers, cerebrospinal axis. These, therefore, may well be called backboned animals. All vertebrates, and none other, have a number of their anterior vertebral joints enlarged and consolidated into a box to form the skull in order to enclose and protect a similar enlargement of the nervous center, viz. The brain, and also usually, but not always, a number of posterior joints enlarged and consolidated to form the pelvis to serve as a firm support to the hind limbs. All vertebrates, and none other, have two cavities, enclosed and protected by the skeleton, viz. The neural cavity above and the visceral or body cavity below the vertebral column. All vertebrates, with few exceptions, and no other animals, have two and only two pair of limbs. The exceptions are of two kinds, viz. A. Some lowest fishes, amphioxus and lampreys, which probably represent the vertebrate condition before limbs were acquired, and B. Degenerate forms like snakes and some lizards, which have lost their limbs by disuse. So much concerns the general plan of skeletal structures and is strongly suggestive of, in fact, it is inexplicable without, common origin. But much more remains which is not only suggestive, but demonstrative of such origin. By extensive comparison, in the taxonomic and ontogenic series, the whole vertebrate structure in all its details in different animals may be shown to be modifications one of another. Sometimes a piece is enlarged, sometimes diminished, or even becomes obsolete. Sometimes several pieces are consolidated into one, but in spite of all these obscurations, corresponding parts usually may be made out. These remarkable similarities in the common general plan alone are convincing evidences of descent, but attention may be called to a like similarity extending to the details of structure. For example, the wings of a bat, a mammal, a bird, and a fossil flying reptile all show the same bones adaptively modified. A series of either fore or hind limbs of a mammal with one toe, horse, two toes, sheep, four toes, hog, and five toes, dog, exhibit a remarkable series of homologies pointing to a five-toed ancestor, and any other series of organs of vertebrates would give the same evidence of fundamental resemblances, homologies. For such a series of facts, the reader must be referred to special books like Wiedersheim's Comparative Anatomy of the Vertebrates, Romain's Darwin and After Darwin, and LeConte's Evolution. The existence of great similarities in vertebrate structure is not always fully recognized. To the superficial observer, the bodies of animals of different classes seem to differ fundamentally in plan, to be entirely different machines, made each for its own purposes, at once out of hand. Extensive comparison, on the contrary, shows them to be the same, although the essential identity is obscured by adaptive modifications. The simplest, in fact the only scientific explanation of the phenomena of vertebrate structure is the idea of a primal vertebrate, modified more and more through successive generations by the necessities of different modes of life. See, then, the difference between man's mode of working and nature's. A man having made a steam engine and desiring to use it for a different purpose from that for which it was first designed and used, will nearly always be compelled to add new parts not contemplated in the original machine. Nature rarely makes new parts, never if she can avoid it, but, on the contrary, adapts an old part to the new function. It is as if nature were not free to use any and every device to accomplish her end, but were conditioned by her own plans of structure, as indeed she must be according to the derivation theory. Thus, in the fin of a fish, the forepaw of a reptile or a mammal, the wing of a bird, and the arm and hand of a man, is found the same part, variously modified for many purposes. Another striking class of the facts of morphology, which admit of scientific explanation only along the line of homology, are the thousands of cases of rudimentary or vestigial structures to be found. Throughout both the animal and vegetable kingdoms, dwarfed and useless representatives of organs are constantly met with, which, in other and allied kinds of animals and plants, are of large size and functional utility. Thus, for instance, the unborn whale has rudimentary teeth, which are never destined to cut the gums, and throughout its life, this animal retains, in a similarly rudimentary condition, a number of organs which never could have been of use to any kind of creature save a terrestrial quadruped. Other well-known examples among vertebrates are vestiges of hind limbs in certain snakes, reduced wings in the apteryx and ostriches, rudiments of eyes in cave fishes, hind limbs beneath the skin of whales, the vermiform appendix in man, as well as useless muscles to move the ears and the skin, and also a very much reduced hairy covering over the surface of the body. Wiedersheim has recorded more than 180 such structural reminiscences in man. Now, rudimentary organs of this kind are of such frequent occurrence that almost every species of organism presents one or more of them, usually, indeed, a considerable number. How then are they to be accounted for? Of course, the theory of descent with adaptive modification has a simple answer to supply, namely, that when from changed conditions of life, an organ which was previously useful becomes useless, it will be suffered to dwindle away in successive generations under the influence of certain natural causes. On the other hand, the theory of special creation can only maintain that these rudiments are formed for the sake of adhering to an ideal type. Now, here again, the former theory appears to be triumphant over the latter, says Romains, for without waiting to dispute the wisdom of making dwarfed and useless structures merely for the whimsical motive assigned, surely, if such a method were adopted in so many cases, we should expect that in consistency it would be adopted in all cases. This reasonable expectation, however, is far from being realized. In numberless cases, such as that of the forelimbs of serpents, no vestige of a rudiment is present. But the vacillating policy in the matter of rudiments does not end here, for it is shown in a still more aggravated form where, within the limits of the same natural group of organisms, a rudiment is sometimes present and sometimes absent. For instance, although in nearly all the numerous species of snakes there are no vestiges of limbs, in the python we find very tiny rudiments of the hind limbs. Now, is it a worthy conception of deity that, while neglecting to maintain his unity of ideal in the case of nearly all the numerous species of snakes, he should have added a tiny rudiment in the case of the python, and even in that case should have maintained his ideal very inefficiently, inasmuch as only 2 limbs instead of 4 are represented? Convincing as are the evidences of descent recorded in the structure of plants and animals, these evidences have been, in the past 30 years, somewhat overshadowed by the far more surprising evidences of descent discovered in the development of plant and animal embryos. A dozen volumes would be necessary to present the mass of embryological evidence, but a few salient facts will illustrate the kind of evidence to be deduced from embryology. Most remarkable of all the principles which have been discovered by embryologists is the recapitulation doctrine, which, briefly stated, is that individual development, ontogeny, recapitulates ancestral history, phylogeny. Illustrations quoted from the works of Romanes and LeConte will make this principle clear. It is an observable fact, says Romanes, that there is often a close correspondence between developmental changes as revealed by any chronological series of fossils which may happen to have been preserved, and developmental changes which may be observed during the life history of now existing individuals belonging to the same group of animals. For instance, the successive development of prongs in the horns of deer-like animals, which is so clearly shown in the geological history of this tribe, is closely reproduced in the life history of existing deer. Or, in other words, the antlers of an existing deer furnish in their development a kind of resume or recapitulation of the successive phases whereby the primitive horn was gradually superseded by horns presenting a greater and greater number of prongs in successive species of extinct deer. Now, it must be obvious that such a recapitulation in the life history of an existing animal of developmental changes successively distinctive of sundry allied, though now extinct, species speaks strongly in favor of evolution. For as it is of the essence of this theory that new forms arise from older forms by way of hereditary descent, we should antecedently expect, if the theory is true, that the phases of development presented by the individual organism would follow, in their main outlines, those phases of development through which their long line of ancestors had passed. The only alternative view is that as species of deer, for instance, were separately created, additional prongs were successively added to their antlers, and yet that, in order to be so added to successive species, every individual deer belonging to later species was required to repeat in his own lifetime the process of successive additions which had previously taken place in a remote series of extinct species. Now, I do not deny that this view is a possible view, but I do deny that it is a probable one. According to the evolutionary interpretation of such facts, we can see a very good reason why the life history of the individual is thus a condensed resume of the life history of its ancestral species. But, according to the opposite view, no reason can be assigned why such should be the case. It is well known, likewise comments LeConte, that the embryo or larva of a frog or toad, when first hatched, is a legless, tail-swimming, water-breathing, gill-breathing animal. It is essentially a fish, and would be so classed if it remained in this condition. The fish retains permanently this form, but the frog passes on. Next, It forms first one pair and then another pair of legs, and meanwhile it begins to breathe also by lungs. At this stage, it breathes equally by lungs and by gills, i.e. both air and water. Now, the lower forms of amphibians, such as Cerodon, Menobronchus, Siren, etc., retain permanently this form and are therefore called perennibronchs, but the frog still passes on. Then the gills gradually dry up as the lungs develop, and they now breathe wholly by lungs but still retain the tail. Now, this is the permanent, mature condition of many amphibians, such as the triton, the salamander, etc., which are therefore called caducibronchs. But the frog still passes on. Finally, it loses the tail, or rather, its tail is absorbed, and its material used in further development, and it becomes a perfect frog, the highest order, Anura, of this class. Thus, then, in ontogeny, the fish goes no further than the fish stages. The perennibronch passes through the fish stage to the perennibronch amphibian. The caducibronch takes first the fish form, then the perennibronch form, and finally the caducibronch form, but goes no further. Last, the Anura takes first the fish form, then that of the perennibronch, then that of the caducibronch, and finally becomes Anura. Now, this is undoubtedly the order of succession of forms in geological times, i.e., in the phylogenetic series. Fishes first appeared in the Devonian and Upper Silurian in very reptilian, or rather amphibian, forms. Then, in the Carboniferous, fishes still continuing, there appeared the lowest, i.e. most fish-like forms of amphibians. These were undoubtedly perennibronchs. In the Permian and Triassic, higher forms appeared, which were certainly caducibronch. Finally, only in the Tertiary, so far as we yet know, do the highest form, Anura, appear. The general similarity of the three series is complete. End of section 15. Recording by Linda Johnson. Section 16 of The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5, edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Biology, Chapter 10, Morphology and Embryology, Part 2. It is a curious and most significant fact that the successive stages of the development of the individual in the higher forms of any group, ontogenic series, resemble the stages of increasing complexity of differentiated structure in ascending the animal scale in that group, taxonomic series, and especially the forms and structure of animals of that group in successive geological epochs, phylogenetic series. In other words, the individual higher animal in embryonic development passes through temporary stages, which are similar in many respects to permanent or mature conditions in some of the lower forms in the same group. Surely this fact is wholly inexplicable except by the theory of derivation or evolution. The embryo of a higher animal of any group passes now through stages represented by lower forms, because in its evolution, phylogeny, its ancestors did actually have these forms. From this point of view, the ontogenic series, individual history, is a brief recapitulation, as it were, from memory of the main points of the phylogenetic series, or family history. We say brief recapitulation of the main points because many minor points are dropped out. Even some main points of the earliest stages of the family history may be dropped out of this sort of inherited memory. This resemblance between the three series must not, however, be exaggerated. Not only are many steps of phylogeny, especially in its early stages, dropped out in the ontogeny, but, of course, many adaptive modifications for the peculiar conditions of embryonic life are added. But it is remarkable how even these, for example, the umbilical cord and placenta of the mammalian embryo, are often only modifications of egg organs of lower animals, and not wholly new additions. It is the similarity, in spite of adaptive modifications, that shows the family history. But even these recapitulations are not so convincing as are those of many internal structures which are not now of any possible use. In the fishes, the lowest class of vertebrates, gills are the organs of breathing. Water taken into the mouth is ejected from the throat through the gill slits, which are lined with delicate vascular membranes. Blood circulating through these membranes absorbs oxygen from the water and gives off carbon dioxide gas. Thus, in the fishes, the gills play the part performed by lungs in higher forms and are essential organs throughout life. Passing up the scale of animal life, amphibian embryos develop gill slits, and they are present and functionally active for a few days in the early life of certain tadpoles. In all amphibians, the slits close soon, and the fully developed frogs and salamanders do not use them for breathing. Certain amphibians have gills throughout life, but they are not the gills corresponding to those of fishes. Now, in interpreting these facts, it should be noted that the embryos of the higher classes, reptiles, birds, and mammals, never have access to water, and yet, in every species whose development is known, gill slits are present in the embryos. For example, in a chick of 3 to 5 days incubation, there are 4 slits on the side of the neck. Likewise, there are several gill slits in human embryos of 3 to 5 weeks development. In all reptiles, birds, and mammals, the gill slits, however, are temporary. They serve no function and close long before hatching or birth. The only interpretation which appeals to the biologist as reasonable is that gill slits in the higher vertebrates are reminiscences of ancestral history and, originally fish organs, they appear regularly in the fish-like stage of every embryo of higher forms, which, in their development, pass through stages comparing in a general way to the adults of lower forms. There are dozens and dozens of similar cases known to occur in the embryology of vertebrates. The notochord, which is the dorsal stiffening axis in the lowest vertebrate, Amphioxus, appears in the embryos of all higher forms. In them, it is purely temporary and disappears as the backbone is developed around it. The lungs of amphibia and higher forms develop in the embryo identically with the air bladder of fishes. In the embryonic development of man and other mammals, 3 pairs of kidneys are formed, only 1 remaining at birth. The first kidneys, pronephros, develop in the stage when gills and other structures correspond to a fish embryo stage, and in some of the lowest fishes, this pair becomes the permanent kidneys. The second kidneys, mesonephros, correspond to an amphibian reptilian stage, and this pair persists throughout life in the amphibia, in the embryos of which the first kidneys are temporarily present. The third kidneys, metanephros, succeed the first and second in mammalian development and remain throughout life. In the higher forms, the first and second kidneys are absolutely useless. The only reasonable explanation of this fact is that the appearance of the first kidneys in amphibian embryos and of the first and second in mammalian embryos is due to this repetition or recapitulation of ancestral history. If space permitted, it would be easy to present abundance of additional evidence to the same effect from the development of the skeleton, the skull, the brain, the sense organs, and, in short, of every constituent part of the vertebrate organization. Even without any anatomical dissection, the similarity of all vertebrate embryos at comparable stages of development admits of being strikingly shown if the embryos are merely placed one beside the other. Here, for instance, are the embryos of a fish, a salamander, a tortoise, a bird, and 4 different mammals. In each case, 3 comparable stages of development are represented. Now, if the series is read horizontally, it can be seen that there is very little difference between the 8 animals at the earliest of the 3 stages represented, all having fish-like tails, gill slits, and so on. In the next stage, further differentiation has taken place, but it will be observed that the limbs are still so rudimentary that even in the case of man, they are considerably shorter than the tail. But in the 3rd stage, the distinctive characters are well marked. So far, examples have been drawn entirely from the vertebrate animals. It should be pointed out, however, that there is a repetition of just the same kind of evidence in all the other groups of animals, and as well in the plant kingdom. When all this mass of evidence is taken together, it is not to be wondered at that the science of comparative embryology should be considered as the principal witness to the theory of descent. But why should ontogeny repeat the steps of phylogeny? Professor LeConte replies that the general answer is doubtless to be found in the law of heredity, that wonderful law so characteristic of living things. We have compared it to a brief recapitulation from memory, the minor points, especially if they be also early, dropping out. But can we not explain it further? It is probable that we find a more special explanation in the law of acceleration, first brought forward by Professor Cope. By the law of heredity, each generation repeats the form and structure of the previous, and in the order in which they successively appeared. But there is a tendency for each successively appearing character to appear a little earlier in each successive generation, and by this means time is left over for the introduction of still higher new characters. Thus, characters which were once adult are pushed back to the young, and then still back to the embryo, and thus place and time are made for each generation to push on still higher. The law of acceleration is a sort of young Americanism in the animal kingdom. If our boys acquire knowledge and character similar to that of adults of a few generations back, they will have time while still young and plastic to press forward to still higher planes. These similarities or homologies of embryology appeal to the thinker, as has been said, as explainable only on the theory of descent. Agassiz, however, held an opposing view. His statements on this point are classical in biological literature. He says, if we now pass to the highest type of the animal kingdom, the vertebrates, there is no lack of evidence to show the identity in their mode of development, as well as the striking resemblance of the young in their earliest stages of growth. The young fish, the young reptile, the young bird, the young mammal resemble one another to an astonishing degree, while they have not one feature in their mode of growth which recalls either the articulate, the mollusk, or the radiate. It is therefore not true, though so often stated, that in their development the higher animals pass successively through the condition of all the lower ones, while it is emphatically true that in each of the 4 great branches of the animal kingdom there is a common mode of development. It is equally true that in certain features, the higher classes of each branch in their younger condition recall the characteristic features of the lower ones, though each class has its own structural character and early diverges from the common starting point. Indeed, modern embryology leads at once to the consideration of the most occult problem as to the origin of animals suggested by these comparisons. What do these resemblances mean, from some of which we shrink as unnatural and even revolting? If we put a material interpretation upon them and believe that even man himself has been gradually developed out of a fish, they are repugnant to our better nature. But, looked at in their intellectual significance, they truly reveal the unity of the organic conception of which man himself is a part, and mark not only the incipient steps in its manifestation, but also, with equal distinctness, every phase in its gradual realization. They mean that when the first fish was called into existence, the vertebrate type existed as a whole in the creative thought, and the first expression of it embraced potentially all the organic elements of that type up to man himself. To me, the fact that the embryonic form of the highest vertebrate recalls in its earlier stage the first representatives of its type in geological times and its lowest representatives at the present day speaks only of an ideal relation, existing not in the things themselves, but in the mind that made them. It is true that the naturalist is sometimes startled at these transient resemblances of the young among the higher animals in one type to the adult condition of the lower animals in the same type. But it is also true that he finds each one of the primary divisions of the animal kingdom bound to its own norm of development, which is absolutely distinct from that of all the others. It is also true that while he perceives correspondences between the early phases of the higher animals and the mature state of the lower ones, he never sees any one of them diverge in the slightest degree from its own structural character, never sees the lower rise by a shade beyond the level which is permanent for the group to which it belongs, never sees the higher ones stop short of their final aim, either in the mode or the extent of their transformation. I cannot repeat too emphatically that there is not a single fact in embryology to justify the assumption that the laws of development, now known to be so precise and definite for every animal, have ever been less so, or have ever been allowed to run into each other. The philosopher's stone is no more to be found in the organic than the inorganic world, and we shall seek as vainly to transform the lower animal types into the higher ones by any of our theories as did the alchemists of old to change the baser metals into gold. Thus did Agassiz reject the theory of descent in the face of the most overwhelming evidence. His view that similarity of development is simply an expression of type in creative thought appeals to scientists today as absurd. Agassiz was the last prominent naturalist who could believe that such things as gill slits were put into embryos of higher forms in order to adhere to an ideal plan in the mind that made them. The paragraphs quoted above from Agassiz suggest that it may not be known what hidden reasons there may have been for the creation of animals with such remarkable similarities in development or adult structure. But, as Romanes has pointed out, a man may quite legitimately say, assuming that the theory of special creation is true, it is not for us to anticipate the form or method of the process. But where the question is as to whether or not the theory is true, it becomes a mere begging of this question to take refuge in the argument from ignorance or to represent in effect that there is no question to be discussed. And if, when the form or method is investigated, it be found everywhere charged with evidence in favor of the theory of descent, the case becomes the same as that of a supposed revelation, which has been discredited by finding that all available evidence points to a natural growth. In short, the argument from ignorance is, in any case, available only as a negative foil against destructive criticism. In no case has it any positive value or value of a constructive kind. Therefore, if a theory on any subject is destitute of positive evidence, while some alternative theory is in possession of such evidence, the argument from ignorance can be of no logical use to the former, even though it may be of such use to the latter. For it is only the possession of positive evidence which can furnish a logical justification of the argument from ignorance. In the absence of such evidence, even the negative value of the argument disappears, and it then implies nothing more than the gratuitous assumption of a theory. End of section 16. Recording by Linda Johnson.
Section 17 of the Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Thomas Bosk. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. Edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Biology. Chapter 11. Evidences of Organic Evolution, Part 1. If a child in the kindergarten be given an assortment of cards of various colors and shapes and a number of boxes into which to put them, it becomes evident that the natural tendency is to group together the cards according to their striking resemblances, for most children probably of color. This is simply an elementary exercise in classification and in fundamentals is parallel with the accepted grouping of plants and animals on the basis of resemblances. Many authors have discussed the bearing of classification on the theory of descent, and among the best is the popular statement of the case by Romanes. It is a matter of observable fact, he remarks, that different forms of plants and animals present among themselves more or less pronounced resemblances. From the earliest times, therefore, it has been the aim of philosophical naturalists to classify plants and animals in accordance with these resemblances. Of course, the earliest attempts at such classification were extremely crude. The oldest of these attempts with which we are acquainted, namely, that which is presented in the books of Genesis and Leviticus, arranges the whole vegetable kingdom in 3 simple divisions of grass, herbs, and trees, while the animal kingdom is arranged with almost equal simplicity, with reference first to habitats in water, earth, or air, and next as to modes of progression. These, of course, were what may be termed common-sense classifications, having reference merely to external appearances and habits of life. But when Aristotle laboriously investigated the comparative anatomy of animals, he could not fail to perceive that their entire structures had to be taken into account in order to classify them scientifically, and also that for this purpose the internal parts were of quite as much importance as the external. Indeed, he perceived that they were of greatly more importance in this respect, inasmuch as they presented so many more points for comparison, and in the result he furnished an astonishingly comprehensive as well as an astonishingly accurate classification of the larger groups of the animal kingdom. On the other hand, classification of the vegetable kingdom continued pretty much as it had been left by the book of Genesis, all plants being divided into 3 groups, herbs, shrubs, and trees. Nor was this primitive state of matters improved upon till the 16th century, when Gesner, and still more Cesalpino, laid the foundations of systematic botany. But the more that naturalists prosecuted their studies on the anatomy of plants and animals, the more enormously complex did they find the problem of classification become. Therefore, they began by forming what are called artificial systems in contradistinction to natural systems. An artificial system of classification is a system based on the more or less arbitrary selection of some one part or set of parts, while a natural classification is one that is based upon a complete knowledge of all the structures of all the organisms which are classified. Thus, the object of classification has been that of arranging organisms in accordance with their natural affinities, by comparing organism with organism, for the purpose of ascertaining which of the constituent organs are of the most invariable occurrence and therefore of the most typical signification. A porpoise, for instance, has a large number of teeth, and in this feature resembles most fish, while it differs from all mammals. But it also gives suck to its young. Now, looking to these 2 features alone, should we say that a porpoise ought be classed as a fish or as a mammal? Assuredly as a mammal, because the number of teeth is a very variable feature both in fish and mammals, whereas the giving of suck is an invariable feature among mammals, and occurs nowhere else in the animal kingdom. This, of course, is chosen as a very simple illustration. Were all cases as obvious, there would be but little distinction between natural and artificial systems of classification. But it is because the lines of natural affinity are, as it were, so interwoven throughout the organic world, and because there is, in consequence, so much difficulty in following them that artificial systems have to be made in the first instance as feelers toward eventual discovery of the natural system. In other words, while forming their artificial systems of classification, it has always been the aim of naturalists, whether consciously or unconsciously, to admit as the basis of their systems those characters which, in the then state of their knowledge, seemed most calculated to play an important part in the eventual construction of the natural system. If we were dealing with the history of classification, it would here be interesting to note how the course of it has been marked by gradual change in the principles which naturalists adopted as guides to the selection of characters on which to found their attempts at a natural classification. Some of these changes, indeed, I shall have to mention later on, but at present, what has to be specially noted is that through all these changes of theory or principle, and through all the ever-advancing construction of their taxonomic science, naturalists themselves were unable to give any intelligible reason for the faith that was in them or the faith that over and above the artificial classifications which were made for the mere purpose of cataloging the living library of organic nature, there was deeply hidden in nature itself a truly natural classification, for the eventual discovery of which artificial systems might prove to be of more or less assistance. Linnaeus, for example, expressly says, "You ask me for the characters of the natural orders. I confess that I cannot give them." Yet he maintains that, although he cannot define the characters, he knows, by a sort of naturalist's instinct, what in a general way will subsequently be found to be the organs of most importance in the eventual grouping of plants under a natural system. I will not give my reasons for the distribution of the natural orders which I have published, he said. You, or some other person, after 20 or after 50 years, will discover them and see that I was right. Thus we perceive that in forming their provisional or artificial classifications, naturalists have been guided by an instinctive belief in some general principle of natural affinity, the character of which they have not been able to define, and that the structures which they selected as the basis of their classifications, when these were consciously artificial, were selected because it seemed that they were the structures most likely to prove of use in subsequent attempts at working out the natural system. This general principle of natural affinity, of which all naturalists have seen more or less well-marked evidence in organic nature, and after which they have all been feeling, has sometimes been regarded as natural, but more often as supernatural. Those who regarded it as supernatural took it to consist in a divine ideal of creation according to types, so that the structural affinities of organisms were to them expressions of an archetypal plan, which might be revealed in its entirety when all organisms on the face of the earth should have been examined. Those, on the other hand, who regarded the general principle of affinity as depending on some natural causes, for the most part concluded that these must have been utilitarian causes, or in other words, that the fundamental affinities of structure must have depended upon fundamental requirements of function. According to this view, the natural classification would eventually be found to stand upon a basis of physiology. Therefore, all the systems of classification up to the earlier part of the present century went upon the apparent axiom that characters which are of most importance to the organisms presenting them must be characters most indicative of natural affinities. But the truth of the matter was eventually found to be otherwise. For it was eventually found that there is absolutely no correlation between these two things, that therefore it is a mere chance whether or not organs which are of importance to organisms are likewise of importance as guides to classification, and, in point of fact, that the general tendency in this matter is toward an inverse instead of a direct proportion. More often than not, the greater the value of a structure for the purpose of indicating natural affinities, the less is its value to the creatures presenting it. Enough has now been said to show three things. First, that long before the theory of descent was entertained by naturalists perceived the fact of natural affinities and did their best to construct a natural system of classification for the purpose of expressing such affinities. Second, that naturalists had a kind of instinctive belief in some one principle running through the whole organic world, which thus served to bind together organisms in groups subordinate to groups, that is, into species, genera, orders, families, classes, subkingdoms, and kingdoms. Third, that they were not able to give any very intelligible reason for this faith that was in them, sometimes supposing the principle in question to be that of a supernatural plan of organization, sometimes regarding it as dependent on conditions of physiology, and sometimes not attempting to account for it at all. Of course, it is obvious that the theory of descent furnishes the explanation which is required, for it is now evident to evolutionists that, although these older naturalists did not know what they were doing when they were tracing these lines of natural affinity, and thus helping to construct the natural classification, I say it is now evident to evolutionists that these naturalists were simply tracing the lines of generic relationship. The great principle pervading organic nature, which was seen so mysteriously to bind the whole creation together as in a nexus of organic affinity, is now easily understood as nothing more or less than the principle of heredity. Darwin first called attention to this line of evidence for evolution in the following words. Naturalists try to arrange the species, genera, and families in each class on what is called the natural system. But what is meant by this system? Some authors look at it merely as a scheme for arranging together those living objects which are more alike, and for separating those which are most unlike, or as an artificial method of enunciating, as briefly as possible, general propositions, that is, by one sentence, to give the characters common, for instance, to all mammals, by another, those common to all carnivora, by another, those common to the dog genus, and then, by adding a single sentence, a full description is given of each kind of dog. The ingenuity and utility of this system are indisputable, but many naturalists think that something more is meant by the natural system. They believe that it reveals the plan of the Creator, but unless it be specified whether order in time or space, or both, or what else is meant by the plan of the Creator, it seems to me that nothing is thus added to our knowledge. Expressions such as that famous one by Linnaeus, which we often meet with in a more or less concealed form, namely, that the characters do not make the genus, but that the genus gives the characters, seem to imply that some deeper bond is included in our classifications than mere resemblance. I believe that this is the case, and that community of descent, the one known cause of close similarity in organic beings, is the bond which, though observed by various degrees of modification, is partially revealed to us by our classifications. Before the days of Darwin, naturalists had classified plants and animals on a tree-like plan and had rejected the old ladder series of early systematists. The tree system is the one which all naturalists regard as the true one. According to this system, Romanes points out, a short trunk may be taken to represent the lowest organisms which cannot properly be termed either plants or animals. This short trunk soon separates into two large trunks, one of which represents the vegetable and the other the animal kingdom. Each of these trunks then gives off large branches signifying classes, and these give off smaller but more numerous branches, signifying families, which ramify again into orders, genera, and finally into the leaves, which may be taken to represent species. Now, in such a representative tree of life, the height of any branch from the ground may be taken to indicate the grade of organization which the leaves or species present. So that, if we picture to ourselves such a tree, we may understand that while there is a general advance of organization from below upward, there are many deviations in this respect. Sometimes leaves growing on the same branch are growing at a different level, especially, of course, if the branch be a large one, corresponding to a class or subkingdom. And sometimes leaves growing on different branches are growing at the same level. That is to say, although they represent species belonging to widely divergent families, orders, or even classes, it cannot be said that the one species is more highly organized than the other. Now, this tree-like arrangement of species in nature is an arrangement for which Darwin is not responsible, for as we have seen, the detecting of it has been due to the progressive work of naturalists for centuries past, and even when it was detected, at about the commencement of the present century, naturalists were confessedly unable to explain the reason of it, or what was the underlying principle that they were engaged in tracing when they proceeded ever more and more accurately to define these ramifications of natural affinity. But now we can clearly perceive that this underlying principle was none other than heredity, as expressed in family likeness, therefore, growing progressively more unlike with remoteness of ancestral relationship. First of all, and from the most general point of view, it is obvious that the tree-like system of classification, which Darwin found already and empirically worked out by the labors of his predecessors, is as suggestive as anything could well be of the fact of genetic relationship. For this is the form that every tabulation of family pedigree must assume, and therefore the mere fact that a scientific tabulation of natural affinities was eventually found to take the form of a tree is in itself highly suggestive of the inference that such a tabulation represents a family tree. If all species were separately created, there can be no assignable reason why the ideas of earlier naturalists touching the form which a natural classification would eventually assume should not have represented the truth, why, for example, it should not have assumed the form of a ladder, as was anticipated in the 17th century, or of a map, as was anticipated in the 18th, or again of a number of wholly unrelated lines, circles, etc., as certain speculative writers of the 19th century have imagined. But on the other hand, if all species were separately and independently created, it becomes virtually incredible that we should everywhere observe this progressive arborescence of characters common to larger groups into more and more numerous and more delicate ramifications of characters distinctive only of smaller and smaller groups. A man would be deemed insane if he were to attribute the origin of every branch and every twig of a real tree to a separate act of special creation. And although we have not been able to witness the growth of what we may term in a new sense, the tree of life, the structural relations which are now apparent between its innumerable ramifications bear quite as strong a testimony to the fact of their having been due to an organic growth, as is the testimony furnished by the branches of an actual tree. Summarizing, it is established that all the general principles and particular facts appertaining to the natural classification of plants and animals are precisely what they ought to be according to the theory of genetic descent, while no one of them is such as might be, and indeed used to be, expected upon the theory of special creation. End of section 17. Section 18 of the Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Thomas Bosk. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. Edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Biology, Chapter 11. Evidences of Organic Evolution, Part 2. First of all, we must take note that the classification of plants and animals in groups subordinate to groups is not merely arbitrary or undertaken only for a matter of convenience and nomenclature, such, for instance, as the classification of stars and constellations, On the contrary, the classification of a naturalist differs from that of an astronomer in that the objects which he has to classify present structural resemblances and structural differences in numberless degrees, and it is the object of his classification to present a tabular statement of these facts. Now, long before the theory of evolution was entertained, naturalists became fully aware that these facts of structural resemblances running through groups subordinate to groups were really facts of nature and not merely poetic imaginations of the mind. No one could dissect a number of fishes without perceiving that they were all constructed on one anatomical pattern, which differed considerably from the equally uniform pattern on which all mammals were constructed, even although some mammals bore an extraordinary resemblance to fish in external form and habits of life, and similarly with all the smaller divisions of the animal and vegetable kingdoms. Everywhere, investigation revealed the bonds of close structural resemblances between species of the same genus, resemblance less close between genera of the same family, resemblance still less close between families of the same order, resemblance yet more remote between orders of the same class, and resemblance only in fundamental features between classes of the same subkingdom, beyond which limit all anatomical resemblance was found to disappear, the different subkingdoms being formed on wholly different patterns. Furthermore, in tracing all these grades of structural relationship, naturalists were slowly led to recognize that the form which a natural classification must eventually assume would be that of a tree, wherein the constituent branches would display a progressive advance of organization from below upward. Now we have seen that although this tree-like arrangement of natural groups was as suggestive as anything could well be of all the forms of life being bound together by the ties of genetic relationship, such was not the inference which was drawn from it. Dominated by the theory of special creation, naturalists either regarded the resemblance of type subordinate to type as expressive of divine ideals manifested in such creation, or else contented themselves with investigating the facts without venturing to speculate upon their philosophical import. But even those naturalists who abstained from committing themselves to any theory of archetypal plans did not doubt that facts so innumerable and so universal must have been due to some one coordinating principle, that, even though they were not able to suggest what it was, there must have been some hidden bond of connection running through the whole of organic nature. Now, as we have seen, it is manifest to evolutionists that this hidden bond can be nothing else than heredity, and therefore that these earlier naturalists, although they did not know what they were doing, were really tracing the lines of genetic descent as revealed by degrees of structural resemblance, that the arborescent grouping of organic forms which their labors led them to begin, and in large measure to execute, was in fact a family tree of life. Here then is the substance of the argument from classification. The mere fact that all organic nature thus incontestably leads itself to a natural arrangement of group subordinate to group, when due regard is paid to degrees of anatomical resemblance. This mere fact of itself tells so weightily in favor of descent with progressive modification in different lines, that even if it stood alone, it would be entitled to rank as one of our strongest pieces of evidence. But as we have seen, it does not stand alone. When we look beyond this large and general fact of all the innumerable forms of life being thus united in a tree-like system by an unquestionable relationship of some kind, to those smaller details in the science of classification which have been found most useful as guides for this kind of research, then we find that all these details, or empirically discovered rules, are exactly what we should have expected them to be, supposing the real meaning of classification to have been that of tracing lines of pedigree. Equally illumining is the massed evidence from paleontology. The record of the rocks as shown by fossils has always been one of the most important lines of evidence for the theory of descent. In Darwin's time, the critics never grew tired of demanding proof from paleontology. A great deal of such proof has been brought forth, but paleontologists caution against expecting a complete record of the animal and plant life of the past. The record is very imperfect, but, to quote from Metcalfe's Organic Evolution, so far as it goes, it is an actual record. Only very unusual circumstances will secure the preservation of any animal or plant as a fossil. An organism, or portion of an organism, to be so preserved usually must be hard. It must be buried beneath soil of the proper kind, and when buried, must be impregnated with mineral salts or in some other way preserved from disintegration. When once converted into a fossil, it must escape destruction at the hands of those agencies that are constantly destroying the rocks: heat, pressure, the disintegration that comes from exposure to the atmosphere, abrasion by ice, and especially erosion by water. The character of whole continents has been repeatedly changed by these agencies. No wonder then, since fossilization is rare and the destruction of fossils when once formed so easy, that our record of past faunas and floras is so scant. It is a cause for congratulation that we have so much of a record as we do possess. Thousands of species of fossil plants and animals are known, and as yet but a small portion of the earth has been searched. Attention will be given to but a few illustrations of the kind of record found in the fossil-bearing rocks, and those records naturally will be chosen that are fairly complete. Turning to a few illustrations of the origin of particular species or organs, the same principle of gradual increase in complexity is found in coming from the older to the younger geological formations. The record of the evolution of branching antlers in the deer, as before mentioned, is fairly complete. The first deer in the early Miocene had no antlers at all. In the middle Miocene are found deer with two-pronged antlers of small size. In the upper Miocene and lower Pliocene are found three-pronged antlers, somewhat larger. In the later Pliocene, four-pronged and five-pronged antlers and still larger are met, while in the Pleistocene clays are seen arborescent antlers like those of the modern deer. Out of the mass of evidence, one further illustration must needs be sufficient. The record of the origin of the horse, worked out by American paleontologists from American fossils, is probably the best example of paleontological evidence of evolution. The horse is especially peculiar in the character of its feet and teeth, and attention will be directed to these points as shown in the accompanying illustrations. In the lower Eocene rocks, an animal, Phenacodus, about the size of a fox, is found having 5 well-developed toes on each foot, and with short and but moderately corrugated teeth. This is one of the simplest known relatives of the hoofed mammals, and from forms something like Phenacodus must have been developed the elephant, rhinoceros, hog, sheep, camel, and all the other hoofed mammals, including the horse and its long line of ancestors. Observe the steps in the transformation of the 5-toed limb of a form like Phenacodus into the 1-toed limb of the horse. These are, of course, but illustrations of the kind of testimony which the study of the rocks contributes toward the proof of the theory of descent. There is, however, an enormous body of uniform evidence to prove 2 general facts of the highest importance in regard to the theory. The first of these general facts is that an increase in the diversity of types both of plants and animals has been constant and progressive from the earliest to the latest times, as it is rational to anticipate that it must have been on the theory of descent in ever-ramifying lines of pedigree. And the second general fact is that through all these branching lines of ever-multiplying types, from the first appearance of each of them to their latest known conditions, there is overwhelming evidence of one great law of organic nature, the law of gradual advance from the general to the special, from the low to the high, from the simple to the complex. The argument for the theory of descent deduced from a comparative study of the phenomena of paleontology, the distribution of species in time, can be supplemented by a like argument derived from a comparative study of the phenomena of geographical distribution. a distribution of the species of today in space. In considering the distribution of living things on the Earth, the first thing to be noted is that there is a decided difference in the animals and plants of different regions. At first sight, differences of climate and other physical conditions would seem to account for this, but there are many phenomena of distribution which cannot thus be explained. Countries exceedingly similar in climate and physical conditions may have quite a different fauna and flora, while those that are unlike may be characterized by similar species of plants and animals. If regions in Australia, South Africa, and western South America, between latitudes 25 and 35 degrees, are compared, it will be found that they are extremely similar in climate and physical conditions. Yet it would not be possible to point out three faunas and floras more utterly dissimilar. Or, on the other hand, if the productions of South America south of latitude 35 be compared with those north of 25 degrees, it will be noted that although climatic conditions are decidedly different, these productions are incomparably more closely related than they are to the productions of Australia or Africa under almost the same climatic conditions. The most interesting evidences of all, however, are derived from a study of distribution in combination with geological records. A good sample of this sort of evidence is to be found in the distribution of marsupials, kangaroos, bandicoots, etc., over the earth. This singular and lowly organized type of mammals constitutes almost the sole representative of the class in Australia and New Guinea, while it is entirely unknown in Asia, Africa, or Europe. It reappears in America, where several species of opossums are found. This anomaly of distribution at first was a puzzle to evolutionists, for it seemed unreasonable to postulate an earlier direct connection of these countries, which are too distant from each other to allow for migration in any other way. When, however, the geological history of the marsupial is taken into consideration, the difficulty vanishes, for fossil records give abundant evidence that at one time before the more complex types of mammals came into existence, the marsupials were spread over the whole eastern and western hemispheres, and that as the higher mammals developed, they exterminated the more primitive marsupials, except that in Australia and New Guinea, the earlier forms persisted, and in America, the opossums remained. That this wide distribution of marsupials was possible in early geologic times is further supported by the fact that other geological evidence shows that Australia and New Guinea were once connected, or nearly connected, with the Malay Peninsula, making migration from the mainland possible. Moreover, the evidence shows that at that early time a very mild climate prevailed far up into the Arctic regions. Hence it is not difficult to believe that migration from Europe and Asia was not unusual. There are many other kinds of evidence to be derived from the study of distribution, some of the illustrations being even more striking than those quoted, but these will be sufficient to show the relation of this kind of evidence to the doctrine of evolution. The last line of evidence to be considered is that of domestication. Everyone is familiar with the great modifications which have been brought about in domestic animals, such as horses, cattle, dogs, pigeons, canary birds, etc. In food plants, as cereals, cabbages, lettuce, radishes, berries, fruits, etc. And in ornamental plants, as roses, carnations, dahlias, pansies, and a host of other forms. Moreover, the ease with which varieties of a given form can be produced is attested to by the work of experimental breeders. Moreover, many of these varieties differ markedly from the forms from which they were derived. Even during the brief history of man, says Leconte, have been formed races of different domesticated animals and useful and ornamental plants, differing so greatly from each other that if found in the wild state, they would unhesitatingly be called different species, or even in some cases, different genera. It is on this last point that objection is often taken to this line of proof. Are even the extreme artificial varieties of any form distinct species, or must they be considered but varieties of the original form? This question shows the opportunity for opposing views hanging on the definition to be given to the term species. It might well be asked, what are the differences between the artificially made extreme varieties, often called races, equivalent, so far as difference of form is concerned, to species and real natural species? On this question, much technical discussion could be given. It will be necessary, however, to allude here only to the most broadly recognized difference, namely that artificially made varieties intercross freely in breeding, producing offspring which are indefinitely fertile, while natural species do not intercross. A great deal of study has been given this phenomenon. Darwin sums up his attitude toward it as follows. It can no longer be maintained that varieties when crossed are invariably quite fertile. From the great difficulty of ascertaining the infertility of varieties in a state of nature, for a supposed variety, if proved to be infertile in any degree, would almost universally be ranked as a species. From man attending only to external characters in his domestic varieties, and from such varieties not having been exposed for very long periods to uniform conditions of life, from these several considerations, we may conclude that fertility does not constitute a fundamental distinction between varieties and species when crossed. The general sterility of crossed species may safely be looked at, not as a special acquirement or endowment, but as incidental on changes of an unknown nature in their sexual elements. It is true that horticulturalists and breeders are intent only on making varieties along the lines of use or beauty from man's standpoint, that is, in size, structure, color, habits, etc., so-called morphological varieties, and not on making physiological species. There is, however, little doubt that mutually infertile races could be bred if the selection of individuals for breeding should be chosen with this idea in mind. Breeders have not cared to breed with this object in view. On the contrary, cross-sterile varieties would be a positive disadvantage to them in limiting the range of their experiments. The important point, so far as evidence of the truth of organic descent is concerned, is to be found in the known changes in type which have been seen to occur in domesticated animals and plants, and in the diversity of forms which are known to have been derived from a few simpler types. As Professor Bailey has said, if the prejudices of scientists respecting the so-called artificial production of species could be overcome, he could just as well draw his proofs of evolution from what has already been done with cultivated plants and domesticated animals, as from similar results which might arise in the future from independent efforts. The trend of the evidence which has been used to prove the truth of the theory of descent having been outlined, the various causes or factors which have brought about organic evolution demand attention. These bear within themselves many problems of no little subtlety, and are borne out by certain correlations of facts which are of absorbing interest. End of section 18. Section 19 of the Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Thomas Bosk. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. Edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Biology, Chapter 12. Factors of Evolution Selection. Part 1. Although concerning the truth of descent there is now no doubt in the minds of biologists, there are many and various views as to the causes or factors which have brought about the origin of species of plants and animals. Most prominent of the theories concerning the factors of evolution is that of natural selection. This theory was conceived independently by Darwin and Wallace, and strange to say, the idea came to both from the perusal of the same book, Malthus's Essay on Population. On reading this book in 1838, Darwin first conceived the idea of natural selection. But he writes, I was so anxious to avoid prejudice that I determined not for some time to write even the briefest sketch of it. In June 1842, I first allowed myself the satisfaction of writing a very brief abstract of my theory in pencil, in 35 pages, and this was enlarged during the summer of 1844 into one of 230 pages. And Wallace writes, in February 1858, I was suffering from a rather severe attack of intermittent fever at Ternate, in the Moluccas, and one day while lying on my bed during the cold fit, something led me to think of the positive checks described by Malthus in his essay on population, a work I had read several years before, and which had made a deep and permanent impression on my mind. These checks must, it occurred to me, act on animals as well as man, and while pondering vaguely on this fact, there suddenly flashed upon me the idea of the survival of the fittest. In the 2 hours that elapsed before my ague fit was over, I had thought out almost the whole of the theory, and the same evening I sketched the draft of my paper, and in the 2 succeeding evenings wrote it out in full, and sent it by the next post to Mr. Darwin. It thus appears, to use Professor Losey's words, that the announcement of the Darwin-Wallace theory of natural selection was made in 1858, and in the following year was published the book, the famous Origin of Species, upon which Darwin had been working when he received Mr. Wallace's essay. The theory has come to bear Darwin's name and is frequently referred to as Darwinism. From time to time there appear articles and pamphlets bearing many titles announcing the decline of Darwinism, and in many periodicals this is often taken to mean that scientific men are giving up the theory of descent or evolution. Not at all. The truth is simply that some scientific men do not accept Darwin's natural selection explanation of the causes which brought about the descent of species. But Darwin's whole theory of natural selection might be discarded without injuring the general theory of descent, for the facts outlined in preceding pages have no necessary relation to theories as to causes, natural selection or other theories. The confusion on this point is doubtless emphasized in the popular mind because Darwin not only set forth his natural selection theory in his book, the full title of which is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, but he also argued for the truth of evolution so well that it came to be generally accepted. However, the general idea of descent was clearly mapped out long before Darwin's time, and he simply put the evidence into more convincing form. Hence, evolution, the fact, is not Darwin's theory, but natural selection, a factor, deserves to bear his name. In order to grasp the full significance of natural selection, it is first necessary to appreciate the astounding facts relating to the struggle for existence. On this point, Darwin's classical statement deserves to be given. The elder de Candolle and Lyell, he said, have largely and philosophically shown that all organic beings are exposed to severe competition. Nothing is easier than to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult than constantly to bear this conclusion in mind. Yet unless it be thoroughly ingrained in the mind, the whole economy of nature, with every fact on distribution, rarity, abundance, extinction, and variation, will be dimly seen or quite misunderstood. We behold the face of nature bright with gladness. We often see superabundance of food. We do not see, or we forget, that the birds which are idly singing round us mostly live on insects or seeds, and are thus constantly destroying life. Or we forget how largely these songsters, or their eggs, or their nestlings are destroyed by birds and beasts of prey. We do not always bear in mind that although food may now be superabundant, it is not so at all seasons of each recurring year. I should premise that I use the term struggle for existence in a large and metaphorical sense, including dependence of one being on another, and including not only the life of the individual, but success in leaving progeny. Two canine animals, in a time of dearth, may be truly said to struggle with each other, which shall get food and live. But a plant on the edge of a desert is said to struggle for life against the drought, the more properly it should be said to be dependent on the moisture. A plant which annually produces 1,000 seeds, of which only one of an average comes to maturity, may be more truly said to struggle with the plants of the same and other kinds which already clothe the ground. The mistletoe is dependent on the apple and a few other trees, but can only in a far-fetched sense be said to struggle with these trees, for if too many of these parasites grow on the same tree, it languishes and dies. But several seedling mistletoes, growing close together on the same branch, may more truly be said to struggle with each other. As the mistletoe is disseminated by birds, its existence depends on them, and it may metaphorically be said to struggle with other fruit-bearing plants in tempting the birds to devour and thus disseminate its seeds. In these several senses, which pass into each other, I use for convenience sake the general term of struggle for existence. A struggle for existence inevitably follows from the high rate at which all organic beings tend to increase. Every being which during its natural lifetime produces several eggs or seeds must suffer destruction during some period of its life, and during some season or occasional year. Otherwise, on the principle of geometrical increase, its numbers would quickly become so inordinately great that no country could support the product. Hence, as more individuals are produced than can possibly survive, there must in every case be a struggle for existence, either one individual with another of the same species, or with the individuals of distinct species, or with the physical conditions of life. Although some species may be now increasing more or less rapidly in numbers, all cannot do so, for the world would not hold them. There is no exception to the rule that every organic being naturally increases at so high a rate that, if not destroyed, the earth would soon be covered by the progeny of a single pair. Even slow-breeding man has doubled in 25 years, and at this rate, in less than 1,000 years, there would literally not be standing room for his progeny. Linnaeus has calculated that if an annual plant produced only 2 seeds, and there is no plant so unproductive as this, and their seedlings next year produce 2, and so on, then in 20 years there would be 1,000,000 plants. The elephant is reckoned the slowest breeder of all known animals, and I have taken some pains to estimate its probable minimum rate of natural increase. It will be safest to assume that it begins breeding when 30 years old and goes on breeding till 90 years old, bringing forth 6 young in the interval and surviving till 100 years old. If this be so, after a period of from 740 to 750 years, there would be nearly 19 million elephants alive, descended from the first pair. But we have better evidence on this subject than mere theoretical calculations, namely, the numerous recorded cases of the astonishingly rapid increase of various animals in a state of nature, when circumstances have been favorable to them during 2 or 3 following seasons. Still more striking is the evidence from our domestic animals of many kinds which have run wild in several parts of the world. And the statements of the rate of increase of slow-breeding cattle and horses in South America, and latterly in Australia, had not been well authenticated, they would have been incredible. So it is with plants. Cases could be given of introduced plants which have become common throughout whole islands in a period of less than 10 years. There are plants which now range in India from Cape Comorin to the Himalaya, which have been imported from America since its discovery. In such cases, and endless others could be given, no one supposes that the fertility of the animals or plants has been suddenly and temporarily increased in any sensible degree. The obvious explanation is that the conditions of life have been highly favorable, and that there has consequently been less destruction of the old and young, and that nearly all the young have been enabled to breed. Their geometrical ratio of increase, the result of which never fails to be surprising, simply explains their extraordinarily rapid increase and wide diffusion in their new homes. In a state of nature, almost every full-grown plant annually produces seed, and among animals there are very few which do not annually pair. Hence, we may confidently assert that all plants and animals are tending to increase at a geometrical ratio. that all would rapidly stock every station in which they could anyhow exist, and that this geometrical tendency to increase must be checked by destruction at some period of life. Our familiarity with the larger domestic animals tends, I think, to mislead us. We see no great destruction falling on them, but we do not keep in mind that thousands are annually slaughtered for food, and that in a state of nature an equal number would have somehow to be disposed of. The only difference between organisms which annually produce eggs or seeds by the thousand and those which produce extremely few is that the slow breeders would require a few more years to people, under favorable conditions, a whole district, let it be ever so large. The condor lays a couple of eggs and the ostrich a score, and yet in the same country the condor may be the more numerous of the two. The Fulmar petrel lays but one egg, yet it is believed to be the most numerous bird in the world. One fly deposits hundreds of eggs, and another, like the hippobosca, a single one. But this difference does not determine how many individuals of the two species can be supported in a district. A large number of eggs is of some importance to those species which depend on a fluctuating amount of food, for it allows them rapidly to increase in number. But the real importance of a large number of eggs or seeds is to make up for much destruction at some period of life, and this period in the great majority of cases is an early one. If an animal can in any way protect its own eggs or young, a small number may be produced, and yet the average stock be fully kept up. But if many eggs or young are destroyed, many must be produced or the species will become extinct. It would suffice to keep up the full number of a tree which lived on an average for 1,000 years if a single seed were produced once in 1,000 years, supposing that this seed were never destroyed and could be ensured to germinate in a fitting place, so that, in all cases, the average number of any animal or plant depends only indirectly on the number of its eggs or seeds. In looking at nature, it is most necessary to keep the foregoing considerations always in mind, never to forget that every single organic being may be said to be striving to the uttermost to increase its numbers, that each lives by a struggle at some period of its life, that heavy destruction inevitably falls either on the young or old during each generation or at recurrent intervals. Lighten any check, mitigate the destruction ever so little, and the number of that species will almost instantaneously increase to any amount. Many marvelous facts concerning the rapid increase of plants and animals have been collected since Darwin's time. Jordan and Kellogg give many instances, and among them the following. It is said that the conger eel lays 15 million eggs yearly. If each hatched and the conger grew to maturity, in a few years there would be no room for any other kind of fish in the sea. The codfish has been known to produce 9,100,000 eggs each year. If each egg were to develop, in 10 years the sea would be solidly full of codfish. The female quinnet salmon of the Columbia ascends the river at an age of about 4 years and lays 4,000 eggs, after which she dies. Half these eggs develop into males. If each female egg came to maturity, we should have at the end of 50 years 8 million trillion female salmon and as many males as the offspring of a single pair. It takes about 100 of these salmon to weigh a ton. Could all these fishes develop, in a very short time there would be no room for them in all the rivers of the north, nor in all the waters of the sea. The records of the spread of the English sparrow in America and of rabbits in Australia are splendid examples of the possible rate of multiplication. Professor Sidney Dickinson gives the following notes on the rabbit of Australia. The fecundity of the rabbit is amazing, and his invasion of remote districts swift and mysterious. Careful estimates show that under favorable conditions, a pair of Australian rabbits will produce 6 litters a year, averaging 5 individuals each. As the offspring themselves begin breeding at the age of 6 months, it is shown that, at this rate, the original pair might be responsible in 5 years for a progeny of over 20 millions. Let the original score that were brought to the country have propagated after some such ratio, No one can doubt who has seen the enormous hordes that now devastate the land in certain districts. In all but the remoter sections, the rabbits are now fairly under control. One rabbiter with a pack of dogs supervises stations, where 100 were employed 10 years ago, and with ordinary vigilance, the squatters have little to fear. Millions of the animals have been killed by fencing in the waterholes and dams during a dry season, whereby they died of thirst and lay in enormous piles against the obstructions they had frantically and vainly striven to climb, and poisoned grain and fruits have killed myriads more. These examples must suffice. Any other animal or plant would illustrate the same principle, for each increases at a rate which would make it cover the earth in a comparatively short time. That this is not the case is due to this check known as the struggle for existence. This was well known before Darwin's time, but he was the first to see its great importance in the development of plant and animal species. The nature of the checks to increase is often complex. One has but to watch a bit of natural land to see them working. Climatic conditions play an important part in limiting the increase, and a wet season will make some crops exceedingly light and many insects very rare. Overcrowding limits the supply of food and other needful things, and hence some plants are choked and many animals starve. Serving as prey to other animals causes enormous destruction of both animals and plants, for thousands of insects and other animal enemies must have food. Thus Darwin, in an observational experiment, noted that out of 357 weed seedlings under observation, 295 were destroyed by insects alone. Various bacterial and other fungus diseases destroy countless thousands of plants and animals in a single day, and it is well known that various diseases due to animal and vegetable parasites are great checks to increase in most species of vertebrate animals. In some cases, the struggle is with the elements. In others, special enemies constitute the most important check. The history of the cottony cushion scale in America, described by Miall, offers a good example of a special check of this sort. About the year 1880, the orange groves of South California seemed to be infected with a kind of leprosy. White patches appeared on the trunks and branches, which at length ran together and covered the bark. The leaves turned yellow, and no fruit could be ripened. The plague spread with rapidity, and all the time-honored remedies were found to be ineffectual. It was soon made known that the symptoms described were due to the attack of a scale insect, known in America as the fluted scale, or cottony cushion scale. This formidable plague gradually increased its range, in spite of the vigorous use of poisonous washes. It was not till 1888 that an effectual remedy was found. The late C.V. Riley, entomologist to the United States Department of Agriculture, had anxiously considered the ways of checking the fluted scale. He found out that it came from Australia, where it infested the bushes called wattles, acacias, that it had been introduced into California about 1868, probably on acacias, that in its native country it was not a serious plague, although no remedies were employed. He concluded that it must be kept down in Australia by natural enemies of some kind which did not exist in California, and that the real policy was to discover and import these remedies, whether parasitic or predatory. In 1888, Riley sent a trained entomologist, Albert Coble, to visit Australia, examine the gardens and report. He found that the fluted scale, though widespread, was kept in check by several insect foes. The most promising of these for Californian purposes was considered to be an Australian ladybird known to naturalists as Vedalia cardinalis. This beetle, both as larva and adult, greedily devours the scale insect and its eggs, preys upon no other species, and is very prolific. Coble was diligent in procuring an abundant supply of Vedalia. The ladybirds were soon distributed and found plenty of occupation. In a year and a half, they had practically rid California of the pest. Nor is this case of the cottony cushion scale alone. Any textbook of economic entomology will cite hundreds of cases of similar kinds. At the present time, the United States entomologists Dr. L.O. Howard, is searching for a special enemy supposed to keep in check the gypsy moth, now so destructive in Massachusetts. Such are some of the influences known to affect plants and animals in the struggle for existence. It is clearly to be seen that the whole question of the relation of the individual to its environment, that is, the problems of plant and animal ecology, are involved in the struggle for existence and in the checks to the tendency to overwhelming increase. Science has only begun to understand these problems of ecology. However, the principle of the struggle for existence is not affected because its causes are not known. This much is certain. Organisms tend to increase rapidly. An untiring struggle for existence exists. The vast majority of individuals perish as a result of this struggle with the environment, the result being, as Darwin believed, that those organisms best fitted to their environment survive, i.e., the struggle for existence leads naturally to the survival of the fittest. This is natural selection. Nature, meaning the sum total of the environmental factors which affect an organism, selects those individuals best fitted to the environment. How this works in detail is best explained after some consideration of the variation of organisms. End of section 19. Section 20 of the Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Thomas Bosk. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. Edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Biology, Chapter 12. Factors of Evolution Selection, Part 2. The foundation of the Darwinian theory is the variability of species, and it is quite useless to attempt even to understand that theory, much less to appreciate the completeness of the proof of it, unless a clear conception of the nature and extent of this variability is obtained. Variation in the state of nature has been discussed by Alfred Russel Wallace in Darwinism. Mr. Wallace shows in some detail that individual variability is a general character of all common and widespread species of animals or plants, and further, that this variability extends, so far as is known, to every part and organ, whether external or internal, as well as to every mental faculty, and that each part or organ varies to a considerable extent independently of other parts. Again, he shows by abundant evidence that the variation that occurs is very large in amount, usually reaching 10 or 20 and sometimes even 25% of the average size of the varying part. But a few examples can be given to illustrate this feature of life. The variability of plants is notorious, being proved not only by the endless variations which occur whenever a species is largely grown by horticulturalists, but also by the great difficulty that is felt by botanists in determining the limits of species in many large genera. As an example may be taken the roses. In Mr. Baker's revision of the British roses, he includes under the single species Rosa canina, the common dog rose, no less than 28 named varieties distinguished by more or less constant characters and often confined to special localities, and to these are referred about 70 of the species of British and continental botanists. Concerning individual variation, the distinguished botanist Alp de Candolle made a special study of the oaks of the whole world, and has stated some remarkable facts as to their variability. He declares that on the same branch of oak he has noted the following variations. In the length of the petiole, as 1 to 3. In the form of the leaf, being either elliptical or obovoid. In the margin being entire or notched, or even pinnatifid. In the extremity being acute or blunt. In the base being sharp, blunt, or cordate. In the surface being pubescent or smooth. The perianth varies in depth and lobing. The stamens vary in number independently. The anthers are mucronate or blunt. The fruit stalks vary greatly in length, often as 1 to 3. The number of fruits varies. The form of the base of the cup varies. The scales of the cup vary in form. The proportions of the acorns vary. The times of the acorns ripening and falling vary. Besides this, many species exhibit well-marked varieties which have been described and named. Among birds, copious evidence of variation is found. The most systematic observations on the individual variation of birds have been made by J. A. Allen in his remarkable memoir On the Mammals and Winter Birds of East Florida. He says, "The facts of the case show that a variation of from 15 to 20% in general size, and an equal degree of variation in the relative size of different parts, may be ordinarily expected among specimens of the same species and sex, taken at the same locality, while in some cases the variation is even greater than this." He then goes on to show that each part varies to a considerable extent independently of the other parts, so that when the size varies, the proportions of all the parts vary, often to a much greater amount. The wing and tail, for example, besides varying in length, vary in their proportionate length of each feather, and this causes their outline to vary considerably in shape. The bill also varies in length, width, depth, and curvature. Even though one has not been impressed with the great variety of individuals in the state of nature, variation in domesticated plants and animals and the efficacy of artificial selection in producing varieties of the different species of plants and animals cannot have escaped notice. The following paragraphs are taken from Mr. Wallace's account of variation in domesticated plants and animals. Everyone knows that in each litter of kittens or of puppies no two are alike. Even in the case in which several are exactly alike in colors, other differences are always perceptible to those who observe them closely. They will differ in size, in the proportions of their bodies and limbs, in the length or texture of their hairy covering, and notably in their disposition. They each possess, too, an individual countenance, almost as varied when closely studied as that of a human being. The same thing occurs in the vegetable kingdom. All plants raised from seed differ more or less from each other. In every bed of flowers or of vegetables we shall find, if we look closely, that there are countless small differences in the size, in the mode of growth, in the shape or color of the leaves, in the form, color or markings of the flowers, or in the size, form, color, or flavor of the fruit. These differences are usually small, but are yet easily seen, and in their extremes are very considerable. And they have this important quality, that they have a tendency to be reproduced, and thus by careful breeding, any particular variation or group of variations can be increased to an enormous extent, apparently to any extent not incompatible with the life, growth, and reproduction of the plant or animal. The way this is done is by artificial selection, and it is very important to understand this process and its results. Suppose we have a plant with a small edible seed and we want to increase the size of that seed. We grow as large a quantity of it as possible, and when the crop is ripe, we carefully choose a few of the very largest seeds, or we may, by means of a sieve, sort out a quantity of the largest seeds. Next year we sow only these large seeds, taking care to give them suitable soil and manure. And the result is found to be that the average size of the seeds is larger than in the first crop, and that the largest seeds are now somewhat larger and more numerous. Again, sowing these, we obtain a further slight increase of size, and in a very few years we obtain a greatly improved race, which will always produce larger seeds than the unimproved race, even if cultivated without any special care. In this way, all our fine sorts of vegetables, fruits, and flowers have been obtained. All our choice breeds of cattle or of poultry, our wonderful racehorses, and our endless varieties of dogs. It is a very common but mistaken idea that this improvement is due to crossing and feeding in the case of animals, and to improved cultivation in the case of plants. Crossing is occasionally used in order to obtain a combination of qualities found in two distinct breeds, and also because it is found to increase the constitutional vigor. But every breed possessing any exceptional quality is the result of the selection of variations occurring year after year, and accumulated in the manner just described. Purity of breed, with repeated selection of the best variations of that breed, is the foundation of all improvement in our domestic animals and cultivated plants. The experience of breeders and cultivators proves that variation is the rule instead of the exception, and that it occurs, more or less, in almost every direction. This is shown by the fact that different species of plants and animals have required different kinds of modifications to adapt them to our use, and we have never failed to meet with variation in that particular direction, so as to enable us to accumulate it, and so to produce ultimately a large amount of change in the required direction. Our gardens furnish us with numberless examples of this property of plants. In the cabbage and lettuce we have found variation in the size and mode of growth of the leaf, enabling us to produce by selection the almost innumerable varieties, some with solid heads of foliage quite unlike any plant in a state of nature, others with curiously wrinkled leaves like the Savoy, others of a deep purple color used for pickling. From the very same species as the cabbage have arisen the broccoli and cauliflower, in which the leaves have undergone little alteration, while the branching heads of flowers grow into a compact mass forming one of our most delicate vegetables. The most remarkable varieties are afforded by the apple, and some account of these will be given as illustrating the effects of slight variations accumulated by selection. All our apples are known to have descended from the common crab of our hedges, and from this at least 1,000 distinct varieties have been produced. These differ greatly in the size and form of the fruit, in its color, and in the texture of the skin. They further differ in the time of ripening, in their flavor, and in their keeping properties. But apple trees also differ in many other ways. Coming now to our domesticated animals, we find still more extraordinary cases, and it appears as if any special quality or modification in an animal can be obtained if we only breed it in sufficient quantity, watch carefully for the required variations, and carry on selection with patience and skill for a sufficiently long period. Thus, in sheep, we have enormously increased the wool and have obtained the power of rapidly forming flesh and fat. In cows, we have increased the production of milk. In horses, we have obtained strength, endurance, or speed, and have greatly modified size, form, and color. In poultry, we have secured various colors of plumage, increase of size, and almost perpetual egg-laying, and in dogs and pigeons, marvelous changes have been effected. The facts of individual variation from the viewpoint of a prominent American botanist will supplement the statements of Darwin and Wallace. Professor L. H. Bailey based his lectures on plant breeding on the universal difference in nature. He says, "No two living things are exact counterparts, for no two are born into exactly the same conditions and experiences. Every living object has individuality. That is, there is something about it which enables the acute observer to distinguish it from all other objects, even of the same class or species. Every plant in a row of lettuce is different from every other plant, and the gardener, when transplanting them, selects out, almost unconsciously, some plants which please him and others which do not. If one were to make the effort, he would find that it is possible to distinguish differences between every 2 spears of grass in a meadow or every 2 heads of wheat in a grain field. All this is equivalent to saying that plants are infinitely variable. The ultimate causes of all this variation are beyond the purpose of the present discussion, but it must be evident to the reflective mind that these differences are the means of adapting the innumerable individuals to every little difference or advantage in the environment in which they live. If no 2 plants are anywhere alike, then it is not strange if now and then some departure, more marked than common, is named and becomes a garden variety. We have been taught to feel that plants are essentially stable and inelastic, and that any departure from the type is an exception, and calls for immediate explanation. The fact is, however, that plants are essentially unstable and plastic, and that variation between the individuals must everywhere be expected. This erroneous notion of the stability of organisms comes of our habit of studying what we call species. We set for ourselves a type of plant or animal and group about it all those individuals which are more like this type than they are like any other, and this group we name a species. Nowadays, the species is regarded as nothing more than convenient and arbitrary expression for classifying our knowledge of the forms of life, but the older naturalists conceived that the species is the real entity or unit in nature, and we have not yet wholly outgrown the habit of mind which was born of that fallacy. Nature knows nothing about species. She is concerned with the individual, the ultimate unit. This individual she molds and fits into the chinks of environment, and each individual tends to become the more unlike its birthmates, the more the environments of the various individuals are unlike. I would impress upon you, therefore, the importance of the individual plant, rather than the importance of the species, for thereby we put ourselves as nearly as possible in a sympathetic attitude with nature, and, resting upon the ultimate object of her concern, we are able to understand what may be conceived to be her motive in working out the problems of life. It should be noted that Darwin did not give much attention to the causes of variation. He simply gathered together the data to show that organisms are highly variable. Given the facts of the high variability of individuals of all plants and animals, and the intense struggle for existence, how will this struggle act in regard to variation? Can the principle of selection, which is seen to be so potent in the hands of man in artificial selection, apply to organisms in a state of nature? These are essentially the questions which Darwin asked, and his own answer, now become a classic in science, is still the most satisfactory. I think we shall see, he says, that the principle of selection, can act most efficiently. Let the endless number of slight variations and individual differences occurring in our domestic productions, and in a lesser degree in those under nature, be borne in mind, as well as the strength of the hereditary tendency. Under domestication, it may be truly said that the whole organization becomes in some degree plastic, but the variability which we almost universally meet with in our domestic productions is not directly produced, as Hooker and Asa Gray have well remarked by man. He can neither originate varieties nor prevent their occurrence. He can only preserve and accumulate such as do occur. Unintentionally, he exposes organic beings to new and changing conditions of life, and variability ensues. But similar changes of conditions might and do occur under nature. Let it also be borne in mind how infinitely complex and close-fitting are the mutual relations of all organic beings to each other and to their physical conditions of life, and consequently what infinitely varied diversities of structure might be of use to each being under changing conditions of life. Can it, then, be thought improbable, seeing that variations useful to man have undoubtedly occurred, that other variations useful in some way to each being in the great and complex battle of life should occur in the course of many successive generations? If such do occur, can we doubt, remembering that many more individuals are born than can possibly survive, that individuals having any advantage, however slight, over others, would have the best chance of surviving and of procreating their kind? On the other hand, we may feel sure that any variation in the least degree injurious would be rigidly destroyed. This preservation of favorable individual differences and variations, and the destruction of those which are injurious, I have called natural selection, or the survival of the fittest. Variations neither useful nor injurious would not be affected by natural selection, and would be left either a fluctuating element, as perhaps we see in certain polymorphic species, or would ultimately become fixed, owing to the nature of the organism and the nature of the conditions. We have good reason to believe that changes in the conditions of life give a tendency to increased variability, and this would manifestly be favorable to natural selection, by affording a better chance of the occurrence of profitable variations. Unless such occur, natural selection can do nothing. Under the term of variations, it must never be forgotten that mere individual differences are included. As man can produce a great result with his domestic animals and plants, by adding up in any given direction individual differences, so could natural selection, but far more easily, from having incomparably longer time for action. Nor do I believe that any great physical change, as of climate, or of any unusual degree of isolation to check immigration, is necessary in order that new and unoccupied places should be left for natural selection to fill up by improving some of the varying inhabitants. For as all the inhabitants of each country are struggling together with nicely balanced forces, extremely slight modifications in the structure or habits of one species would often give it an advantage over others, and still further modifications of the same kind would often still further increase the advantage, as long as the species continued under the same conditions of life and profited by similar means of subsistence and defense. As man can produce, and certainly has produced, a great result by his methodical and unconscious means of selection, what may not natural selection effect? Man can act only on external and visible characters. Nature, if I may be allowed to personify the natural preservation of survival of the fittest, cares nothing for appearances, except in so far as they are useful to any being. She can act on every internal organ, on every shade of constitutional difference, on the whole machinery of life. Man selects only for his own good. Nature only for that of the being which she tends. Every selected character is fully exercised by her, as is implied by the fact of their selection. Man keeps the natives of many climates in the same country. He seldom exercises each selected character in some peculiar and fitting manner. He feeds a long and a short-beaked pigeon on the same food. He does not exercise a long-backed or a long-legged quadruped in any peculiar manner. He exposes sheep with long and short wool to the same climate. He does not allow the most vigorous males to struggle for the females. He does not rigidly destroy all inferior animals, but protects during each varying season, as far as lies in his power, all his production. He often begins his selection by some half-monstrous form, or at least by some modification, prominent enough to catch the eye or to be plainly useful to him. Under nature, the slightest differences of structure or constitution may well turn the nicely balanced scale in the struggle for life, and so be preserved. How fleeting are the wishes and efforts of man, how short his time, and consequently how poor will be his results, compared with those accumulated by nature during whole geological periods. Can we wonder, then, that nature's productions should be far truer in character than man's productions, that they should be infinitely better adapted to the most complex conditions of life, and should plainly bear the stamp of far higher workmanship? It may metaphorically be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world the slightest variations, rejecting those that are bad, preserving and adding up all that are good, silently and insensibly working, whenever and wherever opportunity offers, at the improvement of each organic being in relation to its organic and inorganic conditions of life. We see nothing of these slow changes in progress until the hand of time has marked the lapse of ages, and then so imperfect is our view into long past geological ages that we see only that the forms of life are now different from what they formerly were. In order that any great amount of modification should be effected in a species, a variety when once formed must again, perhaps after a long interval of time, vary or present individual differences of the same favorable nature as before, and these must be again preserved, and so onward step by step. Seeing that individual differences of the same kind perpetually recur, this can hardly be considered as an unwarrantable assumption. But whether it is true, we can judge only by seeing how far the hypothesis accords with and explains the general phenomena of nature. On the other hand, the ordinary belief that the amount of possible variation is a strictly limited quantity is likewise a simple assumption. End of section 20.